What most people misunderstand about an empath's disappearance is that they imagine it as an impulsive emotional reaction, a sudden decision made in a moment of frustration. But that interpretation couldn't be further from reality. What looks sudden on the outside is, in truth, the final stage of a very long internal process. Because empaths don't break when the problem begins, they break when they've already endured far more than they were ever designed to carry. An empath's threshold for emotional discomfort is unusually high, not because they are stronger in the conventional sense, but because they are wired to understand, to rationalize, and to absorb. When tension appears in a relationship, they don't immediately resist it, they lean into it. They ask questions, they analyze, they attempt to decode behavior rather than reject it. Where most people would draw a boundary, the empath extends empathy, and that extension, repeated over time, becomes a pattern. This is where the real danger begins, not in the external situation, but in the internal justification. Because the empath can always find a reason to stay. They tell themselves the other person is struggling, misunderstood, wounded, stressed. And in many cases, those assessments are accurate. But accuracy doesn't make the dynamic healthy. It simply makes it easier to tolerate. So instead of reacting early, the empath adapts. They minimize their own needs. They downplay discomfort. They silence instincts that would otherwise signal, "This is too much." And every time they do this, they move the line a little further. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes normal. What once would have triggered distance now gets explained away. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional debt. Every unspoken frustration, every dismissed feeling, every moment of overextension, it doesn't disappear. It accumulates, quietly, invisibly. And because the empath isn't expressing it outwardly, the people around them often assume everything is fine. There's no conflict, no confrontation, no clear warning sign, just continued presence. But internally, something very different is happening. The empath is keeping track, not consciously, not like a checklist, but psychologically. The mind and body register imbalance even when the person chooses not to act on it. There's a growing sense of exhaustion that doesn't quite make sense at first. A subtle detachment that starts to creep in. Conversations that once felt meaningful begin to feel draining. Effort starts to outweigh reward. And still, they stay. This is the part that confuses people the most. Why would someone continue investing when they're already feeling depleted? The answer is rooted in identity. For many empaths, being the one who understands, who stays, who supports, that's not just behavior, it's who they believe they are. Walking away doesn't just feel like losing a relationship, it feels like betraying their own nature. So they push further, they give more chances, they adjust their expectations. They convince themselves that if they just approach it differently, communicate better, be more patient, show more compassion, something will shift. And occasionally, there are small improvements, just enough to reinforce the belief that staying is the right choice. But those improvements are rarely sustainable, because the underlying dynamic hasn't changed. The empath is still overextending, and the imbalance remains. Eventually, the system reaches its limit. And this is what the breaking point really is. It's not a reaction to one final event. It's the moment when the empath can no longer reconcile the gap between what they're giving and what they're receiving. It's when the internal cost becomes undeniable. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clear. There's a quiet realization that happens here. Something along the lines of, "I can't keep doing this." Not because they don't care, but because caring has come at too high a price. What's important to understand is that this realization doesn't come with anger. It comes with clarity. The empath isn't suddenly overwhelmed, they've been overwhelmed for a long time. The difference now is that they stop denying it. And once that happens, everything changes. The energy they once used to maintain the relationship begins to withdraw. Not intentionally, not as a tactic, but naturally. The same way the body pulls back from something that causes pain. Conversations become shorter. Emotional investment decreases. The instinct to fix, to help, to engage starts to fade. To the outside world, this shift is almost imperceptible at first. But internally, it's decisive. Because when an empath reaches this point, they're no longer negotiating with the situation. They're no longer trying to make it work at any cost. They're observing it clearly, without distortion. And clarity for an empath is often the beginning of the end. The breaking point, then, isn't where they fall apart. It's where they finally stop abandoning themselves. And once someone reaches that level of internal honesty, There's only one direction left to go, because the moment an empath fully recognizes the weight they've been carrying is the moment they begin to put it down and they rarely pick it up again. If the first phase is about endurance, this next phase is about awareness, and awareness is far more disruptive than pain, because pain can be explained away. Pain can be rationalized, minimized, or even normalized. But once awareness sets in, the entire structure holding that dynamic together begins to collapse. For an empath, this awakening doesn't arrive all at once. It's not a dramatic epiphany or a sudden emotional explosion. It's quieter than that, more precise. It often begins with a subtle contradiction, something that doesn't quite add up. A pattern that repeats a few too many times. A moment where words and actions no longer align in a way that can be easily justified. At first, they try to resolve it the same way they always have, through understanding. They look deeper. They give the benefit of the doubt. They consider context, history, stress, past wounds, and again, their interpretations are often accurate. But this time, something is different. The explanations no longer bring relief. They only bring clarity. And clarity in this context is uncomfortable, because what the empath starts to see is not just the other person's behavior, but their own role in sustaining it. Not as a cause, but as a constant. They begin to recognize that their patience has been interpreted as permission. Their forgiveness has been mistaken for tolerance. Their consistency has allowed inconsistency to continue unchecked. This is a difficult realization to sit with, not because it produces guilt, but because it challenges identity. The empath has always seen themselves as someone who helps, who heals, who understands, but now they're faced with the possibility that these same traits, when applied without boundaries, have made them vulnerable to being undervalued. And that realization reframes everything. Moments that once felt confusing start to make sense. The imbalance becomes visible. The one-sided effort, the emotional labor, the lack of reciprocity, it's no longer abstract. It's concrete, measurable, and most importantly, undeniable. What's happening here is a cognitive shift. The empath is moving from emotional reasoning to structural analysis. Instead of asking, why are they acting this way, they begin asking, what is this pattern costing me? That shift in questioning is critical because it redirects focus from the other person's internal world to their own lived experience. And once that shift occurs, the empath begins to reclaim something they've been gradually losing: perspective. They start to see that intention and impact are not the same. That someone can have reasons for their behavior, but those reasons don't erase the effect it has. They begin to understand that empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice. That compassion without boundaries isn't virtue, it's exposure. This is where illusions break down. The belief that love means enduring anything begins to dissolve. The idea that staying is always the stronger choice starts to weaken. And perhaps most importantly, the assumption that their role is to fix or carry others no longer feels accurate, it feels misplaced. Now, this doesn't turn the empath cold. It doesn't strip away their ability to care. What it does is refine it. It introduces discernment. They begin to differentiate between someone who is struggling and someone who is comfortable with them struggling. And that distinction changes how they engage entirely. Because once an empath sees that their energy is being consumed without being valued, they begin to realize that they are not being seen or heard. Continuing to give it starts to feel less like kindness and more like neglect, self-neglect. At this stage, you'll often notice a quiet recalibration. The empath becomes more observant, less reactive. They stop over-explaining. They stop trying to be understood by people who have shown no real effort to understand them. There's a subtle withdrawal of unnecessary effort, not as punishment, but as alignment. And this is where many relationships begin to destabilize. Because the dynamic was built on imbalance. It relied on the empath compensating, adjusting, absorbing. When that behavior changes, even slightly, it disrupts the entire system. The other person may feel the difference, even if they can't articulate it. They may push back, question the change, or attempt to reestablish the old pattern. But the empath is no longer operating from the same framework. They're no longer trying to preserve the connection at any cost. They're evaluating it, quietly, objectively. And once evaluation replaces attachment, the outcome becomes much more predictable. Because the truth is, once you clearly see your value being mishandled, it becomes very difficult to continue offering it in the same way. Not out of pride, but out of awareness. You can't unknow what you now understand. This phase is often misunderstood as distance or detachment, but that's not entirely accurate. It's actually precision. The empath is becoming selective not with their empathy itself, but with where they place it. They're no longer distributing it indiscriminately. They're directing it with intention, and that shift marks the beginning of emotional independence. They're no longer defined by how much they can endure for others. They're beginning to define themselves by how well they can protect what matters within themselves. Their energy, their time, their emotional bandwidth that's no longer an open resource. It's something to be managed, respected, and, when necessary, withheld. What follows from here is not immediate departure, but it is irreversible movement. The empath may still be present physically. They may still engage on the surface, but internally, the attachment has changed form. It's no longer rooted in obligation or hope, it's grounded in awareness. And awareness doesn't negotiate with illusion. Once you truly understand where you stand in someone's life, not based on what they say, but on what they consistently do, you're faced with a choice. Continue investing in a pattern that diminishes you, or step back and realign with your own value. And for the empath who has reached this level of clarity, that choice becomes increasingly simple. Because the moment you recognize that your kindness has been treated as something ordinary is the moment you realize it was never meant to be given to just anyone. By the time we reach this phase, something important has already happened beneath the surface. The empath is no longer trying to figure things out, they've already figured it out. The confusion that once kept them engaged has been replaced with clarity, and that clarity begins to change how they show up in ways that are subtle but decisive. What most people miss is that disconnection doesn't start with distance, it starts with silence. Not the absence of words, but the absence of emotional investment behind those words. The empath may still be present in the room, still responding, still participating on a surface level, but internally, something has shifted. The emotional current that once fueled the connection is no longer flowing in the same way. This isn't a defensive reaction. It's not an attempt to punish or manipulate. It's a natural consequence of awareness. When you clearly see that your energy is not being met, not being valued, or not being reciprocated, your system begins to recalibrate. It starts conserving rather than expanding. And for an empath, that recalibration can feel almost unfamiliar because they're used to giving, not withholding. But this isn't withholding in the strategic sense. It's withdrawal in the biological sense. The same way your body pulls your hand away from a heat source without needing to think about it, the empath begins to pull their emotional energy back from a dynamic that has proven to be unsustainable. And here's where the misunderstanding deepens. From the outside, nothing looks dramatically different at first. There's no confrontation, no clear declaration, no visible rupture. In fact, this phase is often characterized by a kind of calm. The empath stops arguing, stops over-explaining, stops trying to correct misunderstandings that once would have consumed hours of mental energy. And to the other person, that calm can be misinterpreted as improvement. They may assume things are finally stable, that the tension has passed, that the empath has accepted the situation. But in reality, the opposite is true. The empath hasn't accepted the situation, they've accepted the reality of it. And that distinction matters, because acceptance of reality doesn't create closeness, it creates distance. Not out of resentment, but out of alignment. The empath is no longer trying to turn the relationship into something it isn't. They're seeing it for what it is, and adjusting their internal investment accordingly. This is where emotional detachment takes shape, not as a sudden decision, but as a gradual disengagement from expectation. The empath stops expecting to be understood, stops expecting consistency, stops expecting the other person to meet them where they are. And when expectation fades, so does emotional dependency. Without expectation, there's nothing left to negotiate. You'll often notice that during this phase, the empath becomes more neutral. Their reactions flatten. Things that once triggered deep emotional responses now receive minimal acknowledgement, not because they don't notice, but because they've already processed it. Internally, quietly, thoroughly, this internal processing is what allows the external calm. And it's also what makes this phase so final. Because by the time an empath reaches this level of detachment, they're no longer operating from hope. Hope requires uncertainty, some belief that things might change. But the empath, at this point, has moved beyond that. They've observed enough, experienced enough, and reflected enough to understand the pattern in full. They're no longer asking, can this get better? They're asking, is this something I'm willing to continue experiencing? And that question shifts everything, because it places responsibility back where it belongs, not on the other person to change, but on the empath to decide. It removes the illusion that effort alone can transform a dynamic that lacks reciprocity. And it introduces a level of personal authority that wasn't present before. This is where you begin to see a quiet form of power emerge. Not the kind of power that dominates or confronts, but the kind that disengages without needing permission. The empath no longer feels the need to announce their boundaries or justify their distance. They simply begin to live in accordance with what they've already understood. And that often means less availability, less emotional labor, less tolerance for inconsistency, less willingness to carry conversations or connections that feel one-sided. The empath becomes more selective with their attention and more intentional with their presence. And here's the critical part: this change is rarely reversed, because emotional detachment, once fully formed, is not easily undone. It's the result of accumulated insight, not a temporary mood. It's built on repeated evidence, not a single experience. And once someone has seen a pattern clearly enough to detach from it, reattaching would require ignoring what they now know, which creates internal conflict, and the empath has already moved past that stage. So what you're witnessing in this phase is not someone drifting away. You're witnessing someone who has already left emotionally, even if they haven't left physically yet. They're no longer anchored to the connection. They're no longer defined by it. They're no longer trying to repair something that has shown no capacity for repair. They're simply done investing. And when investment ends, presence becomes temporary, because eventually the external reality will catch up to the internal one. The conversations will stop. The proximity will fade. The interaction will dissolve. And to the outside observer, it will feel sudden, like a disappearance without warning. But in truth, the warning signs were always there. They were just quiet, subtle, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Because the loudest exits don't come from anger, they come from clarity. And the moment someone detaches without needing you to notice is the moment you've already lost access to them. By the time we arrive here, the outcome is no longer uncertain. The internal work has already been done. The empath has endured, observed, analyzed, and ultimately detached. What remains is not a question of if they will leave, but how they will leave, and more importantly, why they won't return. This final phase is often the most misunderstood, because people tend to project their own emotional framework onto it. They assume there must be anger, resentment, or some desire for closure driving the exit. But for the empath who has reached this point, those emotions have already been processed and released long before the physical departure ever happens. What replaces them is something far more stable: resolution. Not the kind of resolution that comes from a conversation, an apology, or a mutual understanding, but an internal resolution. A settled awareness that the dynamic has run its course, that the investment no longer makes sense, and that continuing would require a level of self-abandonment they are no longer willing to engage in. And this is where the shift becomes absolute, because earlier in the process, the empath was still negotiating, still hoping, still adjusting, still trying to find a way to preserve the connection without losing themselves. But now, that negotiation is over. The terms have been evaluated, and the conclusion is clear: staying comes at too high a cost. So when the empath finally leaves, it doesn't look the way people expect. There's no dramatic confrontation, no emotional outburst, no long explanation outlining every grievance. In many cases, there's very little said at all. The departure is quiet, composed, almost understated. And that's precisely why it feels so final. Because this kind of exit isn't driven by emotion, it's driven by decision. And decisions, once fully formed, don't fluctuate the way emotions do. They don't reverse under pressure or soften with time. They hold. This is also why the empath doesn't come back. From the outside, it can seem confusing. People assume that time, distance, or even nostalgia will eventually bring the empath back into the connection. After all, if there was care, if there was history, shouldn't that count for something? But what's often overlooked is that the empath has already accounted for all of that. The history, the memories, the emotional significance, they've already been weighed. And despite their value, they weren't enough to offset the cost of staying. That calculation doesn't get undone simply because time has passed. In fact, time often reinforces it, because distance brings clarity. Without the constant exposure to the dynamic, the empath can see it even more objectively. They can reflect without interference, without the emotional noise that once made everything harder to interpret. And what they typically find is confirmation that leaving was not only necessary but overdue. At this stage, there's also a fundamental shift in priorities. The empath is no longer focused on maintaining connections at all costs. They're focused on preserving their internal stability. Peace becomes the metric. Not excitement, not intensity, not even attachment peace. And peace has very specific requirements. It requires consistency. It requires mutual respect. It requires an environment where energy is not constantly being drained or negotiated. And once someone has experienced the absence of those conditions for long enough, they develop a much lower tolerance for anything that disrupts them. So returning to a dynamic that previously caused imbalance doesn't feel tempting, it feels regressive. This is where the idea of closure often comes into question. People believe that in order for something to truly end, there needs to be a final conversation, a moment of mutual understanding, some form of acknowledgement that allows both sides to move forward. But the empath at this point no longer requires that, because closure for them is no longer something granted by another person. It's something they've already created internally. Through reflection, through acceptance, through the willingness to see things as they are rather than as they hoped they would be. And once that internal closure is established, external validation becomes unnecessary. They're not leaving questions unanswered, they've already answered them. They're not avoiding conversation, they've already had the most important one, internally. And they're not holding on to resentment, they've moved beyond it. What they're doing is protecting the outcome of that entire process. Because going back would mean reopening something that has already been resolved. It would mean reintroducing uncertainty into a space that has finally become clear. And more than anything, it would mean risking the very peace they worked so hard to establish. That's a trade they're no longer willing to make. So the empath doesn't circle back. They don't check in, don't revisit, don't maintain a loose connection just in case. Not because they lack compassion, but because they've learned that compassion without boundaries leads them right back to where they started. Instead, they move forward. Quietly, decisively, without the need to announce it or justify it. And this is where their strength becomes most visible, not in how much they can endure, but in what they are finally willing to walk away from. Because walking away in this context isn't an act of rejection. It's an act of alignment. It's the moment where their actions finally match their understanding, where their external choices reflect their internal clarity. And that alignment is what makes the exit permanent, not distance, not silence, not time. Clarity. Because once someone sees something clearly enough, they don't need reminders of why they left. They carry that understanding with them. It informs their decisions, shapes their boundaries, and protects their direction moving forward. So when an empath disappears and never comes back, it's not because they didn't care enough to stay. It's because they finally cared enough about themselves to leave, and once you reach that level of self-respect, there's nothing left behind worth returning to. There isn't actually a key point 5 in the structure you've built, and forcing one in would weaken the precision of the message. But there is a natural final layer that completes the arc of everything you've developed so far. Not another reason they leave, but what happens after they leave, what they become, and why that transformation is so difficult for others to understand. Because once the empath has walked away and chosen peace, something deeper begins to reorganize within them. And this part is rarely discussed because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There's no announcement, no visible milestone. Just a gradual, deliberate shift in how they relate to the world and, more importantly, to themselves. For most of their lives, the empath's identity was externally oriented. Their sense of purpose came from being needed, from being the one who could understand what others couldn't articulate, from holding space where others couldn't. Their attention was almost always directed outward, reading people, adjusting to them, anticipating their needs. But after everything they've experienced, that orientation begins to reverse. Not completely, and not in a way that makes them indifferent, but in a way that introduces balance for the first time. The empath starts asking different questions. Not what does this person need from me, but what does this cost me? Not how can I make this work, but is this aligned with who I am now? And that shift, subtle as it seems, changes everything, because it interrupts a lifelong pattern of self-abandonment. It creates a pause between stimulus and response, a moment where the empath evaluates before engaging rather than automatically stepping in. And in that pause, something new develops: discernment. Discernment is what allows empathy to become selective without becoming absent. It's what separates understanding from over-involvement. The empath still sees deeply, still feels deeply, but they no longer assume responsibility for what they see and feel. This is where their power becomes structured. Before, their empathy was expansive but unguarded. It moved freely, without filters, without limits. And while that made them capable of profound connection, it also made them vulnerable to depletion. Now, that same empathy is guided, directed. It's no longer given automatically, it's given intentionally. And that intention creates a very different presence. People begin to notice that the empath is no longer as easily accessible. Not in a physical sense, but in an emotional one. The immediate availability, the constant willingness to engage at depth, that's no longer there by default. There's a threshold now, a standard, and this is often misinterpreted. Some will see it as distance, others as coldness. Some may even interpret it as arrogance or detachment. But those interpretations are coming from a place that was accustomed to unlimited access. What's actually happening is far more grounded. The empath has learned to regulate their energy. They've recognized that not every connection deserves depth, that not every interaction requires emotional investment. That understanding someone doesn't obligate them to carry that person. And perhaps most importantly, they've accepted that being selective is not a betrayal of who they are, it's a refinement of it. This is where a kind of quiet confidence begins to emerge. Not the loud, performative kind, but something more stable. The empath no longer needs to prove their value through what they give. They're no longer trying to earn their place in someone's life by being indispensable. They understand that their presence by itself has value, and that understanding changes how they move. They become more comfortable with absence, more willing to walk away early when something feels off, rather than staying to confirm it, more attuned to inconsistencies and less tolerant of them. Not in a reactive way, but in a decisive one. And here's what makes this transformation so significant: it's not built on theory. It's built on experience. Every boundary they now hold is backed by something they've lived through. Every decision to step back is informed by a pattern they've already recognized, which makes this version of the empath far less negotiable. Not because they've become rigid, but because they've become clear. They know what drains them, they know what sustains them, and they're no longer willing to confuse the two. So when they move forward, they do so with a different kind of intention. They're not looking for intensity, they're looking for stability. Not for constant emotional exchange, but for mutual respect. Not for someone to fix or be fixed by, but for someone who can meet them without requiring adjustment at the cost of authenticity. And if that kind of connection isn't available, they're comfortable remaining on their own path. Because solitude for them no longer feels like loss. It feels like alignment. That's the part many people don't anticipate. They assume the empath will eventually return, not necessarily to the same person, but to the same patterns. That their nature will pull them back into overgiving, overextending, overinvesting. But what they fail to see is that the empath hasn't just left a situation. They've evolved beyond it. And evolution, once it reaches a certain point, doesn't reverse. It integrates, it stabilizes, it becomes the new baseline. So the empath you knew before, the one who tolerated, who absorbed, who stayed beyond reason, that version no longer exists in the same way. Not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. What remains now is something more balanced, more aware, more deliberate. Still empathetic, but no longer at their own expense. And if there's one thing to take from all of this, it's this: empathy